Daniel Reeves had built an entire life on the land, where he once planned to raise a family and never told a soul why he hadn't married anyone else. Then, one August morning, before the dust on the road had even settled, she stepped down from a wagon with a boy at her side who had his exact eyes. 9 years of silence were about to break, not with words, but with a tin box of letters that had never been sent. The wagon came up the Round Rock Road just past 9 in the morning, cutting a slow trail through dust that hadn't settled since the last cattle drive passed through 3 days before. Daniel Reeves saw it from the porch before he heard it, and something in his chest told him. The way a man knows weather is changing before the first cloud shows itself, that this was not a wagon carrying supplies from Harmon's Mercantile. I was 31 years old, and in 9 years of running cattle along Brushy Creek through 2 droughts, bad enough to kill a lesser operation, he had learned to trust that particular feeling in his chest more than he trusted most things a man could see with his own eyes. The wagon slowed at the gate. A woman climbed down first in a traveling dress. The color of weak coffee dust settled into its folds from what had clearly been a long ride. Daniel knew her before she'd fully turned around. 9 years hadn't changed the way she held her shoulders square and certain even now, even here. Josephine Calloway. He set down the coffee cup he'd been holding without noticing he still had it in his hand. Then a boy climbed down after her. He couldn't have been more than 8, maybe 9, dressed in a coat, too warm for a Texas August, gripping his mother's skirt with one hand, while the other shielded his eyes against the sun. He looked around the yard, the barn, the corral, the long fence line running toward the creek, with the frank, open curiosity of a child seeing something for the first time. Then he looked at Daniel, and Daniel's coffee cup, which he had set down without noticing, tipped over and spilled across the porch boards because the boy had his eyes. Not close, not similar. His exact gray-green with the same slight downward tilt. His own mother used to say came from his grandfather's side of the family. "Josie," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. 9 years of unspoken things caught somewhere behind it. "What is this?" She came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped there, her hands pressed flat against her skirt to keep them steady. "I know I owe you an explanation," she said. "I know 9 years is a long time to wait for one. But I needed you to hear it from me, and I needed you to see him before anything else got said." "Who is he?" It wasn't a question so much as a demand plain as a fence post, and Josie didn't flinch from it. "His name is Samuel," she said. "He's 8. He'll turn 9 in October." Daniel did the arithmetic without meaning to. 9 years back was the spring he'd cleared the timber for a house he never built. 9 years back was the last time he'd held Josie Calloway's hand at the crossing on Brushy Creek before her family disappeared from Round Rock in the space of a single night. And every question he'd asked afterward had gotten him nothing but silence and a look he still didn't understand. The numbers landed exactly where something in his gut had already started to suspect the moment the boy looked up at him. "He's mine," Daniel said. "Not a question either." "He's yours," Josie said, and her voice broke on the word, though her chin stayed lifted, the same small, stubborn tilt he remembered from a lifetime before. "He has been since before I ever left this town. I didn't know it myself until I was already 3 weeks gone. And by then..." She stopped, started again. "By then, I believed things about you I had no right to believe because I was never given the chance to hear the truth from your own mouth. Same as I expect you believed things about me." Samuel had let go of his mother's skirt and wandered a few steps toward the porch rail, watching a pair of barn swallows dip low over the yard, giving the 2 adults the kind of unconcerned distance only a child not yet burdened with the whole shape of a story could offer. Daniel came down off the porch slowly, the way a man approaches something he isn't sure yet how to hold. He stopped an arm's length from Josie, close enough to see the gray already threading through hair that used to be pure black. Close enough to see 9 years of something heavy sitting behind her eyes. "I looked for you," he said. "Not right off. I didn't know where to start right off. But I looked. Wrote to your aunt in San Antonio. Wrote to a church in Austin your mother used to mention. Got nothing back. Nothing at all, Josie, for 9 years. And I stopped believing after the 3rd year that I'd get an answer, and I hated myself for stopping. I wrote you every week for 3 months," Josie said, and now her voice did break fully. Every week, Daniel. I never once stopped believing you'd answer until I finally understood you weren't going to." Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Somewhere past the barn, a meadowlark called out, indifferent to the 2 people standing frozen in the yard, indifferent to the boy, watching swallows, indifferent to 9 years of a story that had just cracked itself open on a dirt road at 9 o'clock on an August morning. Daniel looked past her to Samuel, who had turned back around, curious now about the man standing so still in front of his mother. "You'd best come inside," Daniel said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "Both of you. There's a great deal I expect we need to work out, and I don't intend to do it standing in the road, where half the county can watch us do it." Josie nodded, and for the first time since the wagon had come up the road, something in her shoulders loosened just slightly, like a woman setting down a weight she had carried a very long way. But neither of them yet knew that the man responsible for 9 years of silence between them was still very much in Round Rock, still holding a county office that gave him power over half the land disputes in the district, and had no intention of letting the truth walk back into town without a fight of his own. To understand that morning in the yard, you have to go back 9 years to the spring of 1877, when Daniel Reeves was 22 and hadn't yet learned that a man could lose something without anyone in town ever calling it a loss out loud. He and Josephine Calloway had grown up a mile apart along the same stretch of Brushy Creek, her father's forge, sitting at the edge of town, where the road bent toward the mercantile, his family's cattle land running out past the last fence line toward open country. Everybody in Round Rock knew Amos Calloway's forge knew. It made the strongest wagon axles and the truest horseshoes in 3 counties, and everybody in their own quiet and unspoken way knew that his daughter Josie had a gift for reading fabric, the way other folks read scripture. Daniel first noticed her properly at 17, watching her measure cloth at Harmon's Mercantile without ever once glancing down at her hands, her eyes instead following the pattern she was already building in her head. It took him 5 more years to work up the nerve to say much of anything to her beyond good morning. When he finally did, it was down at the Brushy Creek crossing a shallow stretch of water where cattle forded easy, and where as children, half the town's young ones had learned to skip stones without their mothers knowing. Josie had come down to gather watercress for her mother. Daniel had come down pretending he needed to check the fence line, though the fence at that stretch hadn't needed checking in a month. "You're not fooling anybody, Daniel Reeves," she told him, not even looking up from the creek bed. "Wasn't trying to fool you," he said. "Just trying to work up the nerve to talk to you without an excuse." She'd laughed at that, short and startled, and something about the sound of it settled into Daniel's chest and stayed there for the better part of a decade. They kept meeting at that crossing through that whole spring and into summer, careful about it in the way 2 people have to be careful in a small Texas town where everyone already has an opinion about who belongs with whom. Josie taught him without ever quite meaning to teach him anything, the particular way she held a needle steady even in poor light, sewing by lamplight after her father's forge went quiet for the evening. Daniel taught her how to read a cattle trail by the bent grass and the fresh-turned dirt knowledge that had never once seemed useful to her until the day it did. I gave her a brass pin that spring plain and small meant for holding thread spools steady while she worked. It wasn't much of a gift by most measures. Josie kept it pinned inside her sewing basket from that day on and used it every single day for the rest of the time she stayed in Round Rock. It was at the crossing in June, with the creek running low and clear over smooth stone, that Daniel finally said what he'd been working up to since April. He didn't kneel the ground. There was mostly gravel, and he later admitted he hadn't thought that part through, but he took both her hands and asked her plainly whether she'd have him, whether she'd build a life with him on the land his father had already agreed to set aside along the north pasture. Josie didn't answer right away. Not because she doubted it, because she told him later she wanted to hold the moment a little longer before it became something that had already happened. "Yes," she finally said. "Yes, Daniel Reeves, though I expect half this town is going to have something to say about it." "Let them," he said. "I've got no interest in a life built around what half this town has to say." They kept their understanding quiet through that summer, though. Quiet in a small town rarely stays quiet for long. By August, most of Round Rock had some notion that the Reeves boy and the Calloway girl had an understanding, and most of Round Rock, in its own uneven way, had decided to let it be, some out of genuine goodwill, some simply out of the practical recognition that Amos Calloway's forge and the Reeves cattle operation, joined by marriage, would serve the town well, regardless of what either family looked like standing side by side at church. Not everyone felt that way. Walter Pruitt, who ran the Cotton Gin at the edge of town and had recently taken on the county's tax assessment work, had his own reasons for watching the match, with something closer to calculation than goodwill reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a parcel of creekside land. The Calloway Forge sat on land Pruitt had quietly begun eyeing for a rail spur deal he hadn't yet mentioned to anyone in town. Daniel and Josie knew none of this that August evening at the crossing, wading ankle-deep in water gone gold, with the last of the sunset, Daniel's hand steady under her elbow as she crossed the slick stones toward him. "We'll be married by next spring," Daniel said. "I'll have the house built by then. Timber's already cut." "Next spring," Josie agreed, and there was no doubt at all in the way she said it. No shadow yet of everything that was coming for both of them. Neither of them could have known, standing in that low gold water, with the whole of Round Rock believing their story already settled, that they had less than a year left before a lie neither of them had any part in building would tear the ground out from under everything they'd planned. What neither of them noticed walking back up from the crossing in the last of that evening light was the lamp already burning late in Walter Pruitt's office above the Cotton Gin, or the careful, patient way he'd begun asking around town about who exactly held the deed to the creekside parcel by the Calloway Forge. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in September, though nobody in the Calloway household understood its full shape until nearly a week later. Amos Calloway had run his forge at the edge of Round Rock for 11 years, without a single mark against his name, respected by ranchers and merchants alike for work that held up in weather that broke lesser craftsmanship apart. So when Deputy Sheriff Combs rode out to the forge that Tuesday with a ledger tucked under his arm and a look on his face that suggested he didn't much want to be there, Amos assumed at first there'd been some mistake concerning an unpaid bill, nothing more. The ledger told a different story. According to the figures written inside figures bearing Amos's own signature, or something close enough to pass for it to an unpracticed eye, he had drawn against credit at Harmon's Mercantile for the better part of 2 years, running up a debt of nearly $400 he had never once acknowledged or begun to repay. Worse, a second page, water-stained just enough to look aged, suggested he'd falsified receipts to cover the shortfall. "I never signed this," Amos said, turning the ledger over in hands, still black with forge soot. "I don't owe Harmon a nickel past what's due at month's end, same as always." "Might be so," Combs said not unkindly. But Mr. Pruitt brought this to the county office himself, notarized and all. Says he found irregularities doing the fall tax assessment. Man like that holding the office he holds, folks are inclined to believe him over a ledger dispute. Amos didn't yet know that Walter Pruitt had spent 3 careful weeks studying his signature off old invoices at Harmon's Mercantile, or that the notary seal pressed into the corner of the false ledger had been borrowed without permission from a county clerk's office desk drawer while its owner was out to lunch. He knew only that a man with authority over land assessments tax disputes, and as it happened, no small influence over the sheriff's office, had just accused him of theft in front of half the men who did business with his forge. Word moved through Round Rock the way it always did, fast and imprecise, gathering weight with each retelling. By Thursday, 2 customers who'd stood by Amos for a decade quietly took their wagon work to a smith in Georgetown instead. By Friday, someone had chalked the word thief on the forge's front post overnight, and though Amos scrubbed it clean before Josie woke, she saw the ghost of it in the wood grain for weeks after. "They mean to arrest you," Josie's mother said that Friday evening, her voice low and controlled in the particular way of someone holding herself together by main force. "Combs told your father plain. Says the county's set on making an example given who's pushing it." Amos sat at the kitchen table that night, with the false ledger's numbers laid out in his own careful hand, trying to find some thread of proof he could carry to the county office that would outweigh a notarized document and a tax assessor's word. He found none. A black tradesman's account of his own honesty, weighed against a white county official's signed paperwork, was not in 1877 Round Rock a contest either of them expected to win. "We leave tonight," Amos said, finally quiet final, "before Combs comes back with a warrant instead of a warning." Josie stood in the kitchen doorway, with her sewing basket still in her hands, the brass pin Daniel had given her caught in the lamplight. "Papa, I can't just. Daniel and I are to be married in the spring. I have to tell him something at least. I can't simply vanish on him same as—" "You'll tell him nothing tonight," Amos said, and though his voice stayed gentle, there was no room left in it for argument. "Not because I don't trust him, Josephine. Because I don't trust what happens to a young white rancher who stands up publicly for a black family accused of theft by the county's own taxman. I've seen what happens to men who make that kind of stand in this county, and I won't have Daniel Reeves ruined alongside us for a debt he had no part in and no way to disprove any faster than I can." It was, Josie understood only years later, the single decision that cost them the most. Not the false ledger, not Pruitt's careful scheming. Her father's frightened, loving choice to protect the man she loved by keeping him entirely in the dark, a choice made in one desperate evening that neither of them had any way of knowing would stretch into 9 years of silence on both sides. She wrote one line that night, meaning to leave it somewhere Daniel would find it. In the end, packed what little the family could carry by lantern light before dawn, she never found the moment to deliver it. And the note went with her, folded and refolded so many times over the years that the ink eventually wore thin at the creases. By the time the sun came up over Round Rock that Wednesday morning, the Callaway wagon was already 11 miles gone, and Daniel Reeves woke to an empty forge, a locked door, and no explanation at all beyond the rumors already spreading through town by breakfast. The Callaway wagon reached Austin 4 days after leaving Round Rock, following back roads Amos knew from years of hauling iron stock between towns, avoiding the main coach road, where word of a wanted man's family might travel faster than they could outrun it. Josie's aunt had once mentioned a boarding house near the Capitol grounds run by a widow named Odell, who took in respectable black tenants without asking too many questions. 2 days of being turned away elsewhere led them to Mrs. Odell's narrow clapboard house on a side street off Congress Avenue, and she took one look at Amos's blistered hands and Josie's exhausted posture and didn't ask a single question that first evening beyond how many rooms they'd need. Amos found work within the month at a wagon shop on the east side of the city, his skill speaking for itself in a town large enough that word of a false accusation from a small county 80 miles north hadn't yet traveled. Josie took in sewing the same steady work she'd always known, though now every stitch she set was for strangers rather than a wedding dress her mother had been saving good cloth for since Josie turned 16. She wrote to Daniel the first week a full letter explaining everything: the ledger, Pruitt, her father's fear, her love for him undimmed, despite the distance forced between them, and walked it herself to the Austin post office rather than trust it to anyone else's hands. She wrote again the second week, shorter this time, asking only whether he'd received the first. By the sixth week, with no reply at all, her letters had thinned down to a handful of aching lines, until by the 12th week she stopped writing entirely, not because she'd stopped hoping, but because hope of that particular kind had become more than she could carry alongside everything else. What Josie couldn't have known was that every one of those letters had reached Round Rock's small post office exactly as addressed, and had been quietly pulled from the outgoing mail sorting table by the postmaster himself before they ever reached Daniel Reeves's hands. Walter Pruitt held the postmaster appointment as one of several small county offices he'd accumulated over the years, and it had taken him almost no effort at all to set aside a stack of letters addressed in a hand he recognized immediately and simply never passed them along. He told himself, in the careful way men tell themselves things they'd rather not examine too closely, that he was doing the Reeves boy a kindness. A young rancher building toward real standing in the county had no business tangled up with a family under suspicion of theft, Pruitt reasoned. Better the connection simply faded on its own quietly, without anyone having to say an unkind word about it directly. It was in her third month in Austin that Josie understood she was carrying Daniel's child, conceived in the final tender weeks before her family's world came apart. She sat with Mrs. Odell in the boarding house kitchen the evening she was certain turning the news over out loud for the first time, and the older woman, who had raised 3 children alone after her own husband's early death, offered her the only practical comfort she had. "You'll manage," Mrs. Odell said. "Women have managed worse with less than what you've got. You've got a trade. You've got your father nearby, and you've got a child who's going to know exactly who loves him, which is more than plenty of children raised in fuller houses can say." Josie told the neighbors in time that she was a young widow, a story simpler by far than explaining a broken engagement, a false accusation, and a man she now believed had let her go without so much as a word of protest. It was easier, she told herself, though some nights, working by lamplight on another woman's wedding dress, the lie sat heavier in her chest than the truth ever would have. Samuel was born the following June. In the small upstairs room Mrs. Odell had given over to her with a full head of dark hair, and even in those first days, eyes that made Josie's breath catch every time she looked into them. She raised him in that narrow house on the side street off Congress Avenue for the better part of 8 years, watching him grow into a boy with his father's steadiness and his own quiet curiosity about a place he'd never seen, a ranch along a creek in a town called Round Rock, that his mother mentioned only rarely, and always with a particular careful quiet in her voice that even a young child learned not to press. It was a letter from her own mother delivered the summer Samuel turned 8 that finally changed everything, though not in any way Josie could have anticipated when she first broke the seal. Daniel Reeves spent the better part of a decade building an operation that gave the appearance to anyone riding past his gate of a man who had exactly what he wanted out of life. He'd inherited his father's spread 2 years after Josie disappeared, when a fever took the older man in the single hard week that left Daniel at 24, the sole owner of 900 acres along Brushy Creek, and considerably more debt than he'd expected to carry. He worked through it the way he worked through most things, without much complaint and without much rest. Expanding his herd acre by acre through 2 droughts severe enough that half the small operations in Williamson County folded outright and sold their land off cheap to whoever still had capital left to buy it. By his 30th year, Daniel Reeves ran one of the steadier cattle operations left in the district, respected at the stockyards in Fort Worth and trusted by the bank in Round Rock for credit. Other ranchers couldn't easily get. Folks in town called him steady, dependable. A man who had, for reasons nobody pressed him about too directly, simply decided that marriage wasn't a road he meant to travel. What none of them knew was that he still kept in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk in his study a half-finished wooden comb he'd started carving. The spring before Josie left meant to be a wedding gift, the handle shaped with a pattern of creek reeds he'd never quite gotten right. He took it out some winter nights, when the work slowed and the house got too quiet, turning it over in his hands and wondering, same as he had for 9 years, what exactly had happened that he'd never been given the chance to understand. He'd written to her aunt in San Antonio within the first month, and to a church in Austin her mother had once mentioned in passing addresses, gathered from memory rather than certainty. Both letters went unanswered, not because they weren't delivered, but because Josie's aunt had passed on 2 years before Daniel ever wrote, and the church in Austin, it turned out, was the wrong congregation, entirely one town over from where Josie actually lived. By his 3rd year, Daniel stopped writing altogether. More than one family in Round Rock had over the years angled a daughter his way at church socials, and Daniel was always polite about it and never once followed through. Nobody quite understood why, beyond a vague sense that he carried something behind his eyes that kept him from settling. His foreman, an older man named Otis, who'd worked the Reeves land since before Daniel was born, was about the only one who ever asked outright, "Man your age land, like this herd like this," Otis said one evening watching Daniel work a length of rope into a new latch for the barn door long after the light had gone. "Be easier with somebody in that house besides yourself." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Hasn't been the right time." 9 years is a fair stretch of not the right time. Daniel didn't answer that one at all, and Otis, who understood the particular silence of a man not ready to say more, let it be. Walter Pruitt, meanwhile, had spent those same 9 years quietly expanding his own holdings, adding the county tax assessor's office and the Round Rock postmaster appointment to his existing ownership of the cotton gin until few land or water disputes in the district settled without his signature somewhere on the paperwork. He'd never mentioned the rail spur plan directly to anyone in town, though the surveyors he'd quietly hired over the years had confirmed more than once that the most efficient route ran directly through the old Callaway Forge parcel land the county still technically held a lien against on account of an unpaid debt that had never once actually existed. It was Otis who brought Daniel the news that finally cracked 9 years of careful, settled, quiet, wide-open riding in from town on a Tuesday afternoon in early August, with a look on his face that told Daniel something significant before he'd said a single word. "Callaway wagon came through town this morning," Otis said, swinging down off his horse. "Heading out toward your place from what I heard at the Mercantile. Josephine Callaway. Grown woman now, of course. Had a boy with her." Daniel stood very still in the yard, the half-carved comb suddenly present in his mind, though it sat locked away in a drawer inside the house. "How old a boy?" he said, though some part of him had already begun doing the arithmetic before Otis finished answering. Inside the ranch house, Josie sat at Daniel's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't yet tasted, while Samuel explored the front room at a careful, curious distance, drawn to a mounted set of longhorns above the fireplace, but keeping half his attention on the 2 adults at the table. "Tell me all of it," Daniel said. "From the start. I've waited 9 years for the start, so Josie told him. The false ledger. Deputy Combs riding out with a notarized document neither of them had ever seen before that morning. Her father's decision made in a single frightened evening to leave before dawn rather than risk a warrant landing on a black tradesman's word against a county official's signed paperwork. The 3 months of letters she'd written and mailed herself, never once missing a week, until the silence finally convinced her what she'd feared from the very beginning, that Daniel had simply let her go rather than tangle himself in a scandal not his own. "I never got one letter," Daniel said, and something in his voice had gone low and rough. "Not one, Josie. I wrote to your aunt in San Antonio inside the first month. Wrote to a church in Austin your mother mentioned once at a social years before any of this happened. Got nothing back either time, and after the 3rd year I told myself you'd made your choice, and I had no right chasing a woman who didn't want to be found." "I never stopped wanting to be found," Josie said, and her voice cracked fully now, 9 years of careful composure, finally giving way at Daniel's own kitchen table. "I built a whole life in Austin telling myself you'd let me go, and the whole time you were 9 miles from where I grew up, believing the very same lie about me." Neither of them said Walter Pruitt's name yet, though something in the shape of the story, sets of letters sent and never received on both sides of the same 9 years, had already begun forming an uneasy suspicion in both their minds that this had not simply been misfortune. Daniel got up from the table without a word and crossed to the roll-top desk in the corner of the front room, opening the bottom drawer and drawing out a comb, half-finished its handle carved with a pattern of reeds, bent the way they bent at the Brushy Creek crossing in late summer, when the water ran low and clear over smooth stone. "Started this the spring before you left," he said, setting it on the table between them. "Meant to finish it by the wedding. Never could bring myself to either finish it or throw it out." Josie picked it up carefully, running her thumb along the unfinished grooves of the reed pattern, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, because there was nothing she could say that wouldn't break something open in her chest that had stayed carefully closed for 9 years. "I used to sew that same pattern into everything," she said, finally quiet. "Samuel's first blanket has reeds along the border, same bend to them as this. Never could say exactly why, except that it was the last thing I remembered clearly from before everything came apart. The creek, the reeds, you teaching me to read the water." Samuel had wandered close enough by then to hear the last of it, and he looked between the comb in his mother's hands and the tall, quiet man watching her with an expression Samuel didn't yet have the words, for though he understood, in the plain, unguarded way children often understand things before adults expect them to, that something important was happening in this kitchen. "Is that for me?" Samuel asked, nodding at the comb, and something in the easy, unafraid way. He asked it, no hesitation, no wariness. Simply a boy, curious about an object on a table, caught Daniel somewhere in the chest he hadn't expected. "Someday maybe," Daniel said. "Once I've finished it properly. A man ought to finish what he starts." Josie set the comb back down between them, her hand resting near it, not quite touching Daniel's own hand a few inches away, though the distance between them had narrowed considerably from where it had stood on the porch that morning. "My mother wrote me a month ago," she said. "Told me the county's moved to auction the forge property for unpaid taxes tied to that old debt, a debt that never existed in the first place. My father's health isn't what it was, Daniel. He can't fight this the way he might have 9 years back. I came home to fight it for him. I didn't come back expecting to find you exactly where I left you, still carrying a comb you never finished. 9 years, and I never once considered building a life anywhere else but exactly where I left it," Daniel said. "Whatever's coming for your father's land, Josie, you won't be fighting it alone this time. Not while there's breath left in me to stand beside you." Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, throwing long shadows across the yard, and somewhere out past the corral, A horse nickered low, patient, waiting on nothing in particular, except the ordinary turning of an ordinary day, though nothing about this particular day, for either of the two people sitting at that kitchen table had turned out ordinary at all. Neither of them yet knew how little time that quiet would be given to last. The days that followed settled into something neither Josie nor Daniel had quite the language for, yet not courtship, exactly. Not simply old friends catching up, but something steadier and more careful than either, built out of 9 years of questions finally getting answered one at a time. Samuel, for his part, took to the ranch, the way a child raised in a narrow boarding house room on Congress Avenue takes to open country for the first time in his life, with an eagerness that seemed to catch him by surprise as much as anyone watching him. Daniel found him at the corral fence on the third morning, one boot hooked over the bottom rail, watching an old gray mare named Clover graze with the particular fixed attention of a boy who had never in his life been close enough to a horse to notice how her ears turned toward every sound in the yard. "You'll want to let her catch your scent first," Daniel said, coming up beside him without quite planning to. Horses trust a slow hand a good deal more than an eager one. "I've never touched a real horse," Samuel admitted. "We had a mule once at Mrs. Odell's for pulling the cart. Mama wouldn't let me near him. Said he had a temper." "Clover's got no temper worth mentioning," Daniel said. "Mostly opinions about which direction she'd rather graze." He showed Samuel how to hold his palm flat and steady, patient enough to let the mare come to him rather than reaching first, and when Clover finally closed the last few feet and nudged Samuel's open hand, hunting for a treat that wasn't there. The boy laughed, bright and startled in a way that settled something unfamiliar and warm in Daniel's chest. They walked the fence line together most mornings after that, Daniel checking wire and posts out of old habit, Samuel trailing alongside with a boy's endless supply of questions. He ran a finger along a taut stretch of wire near the north pasture one morning and frowned at it. "This isn't like any fence I've seen," he said. "The ones in Austin are mostly wood or nothing at all." "Wire fencing's newer out this way than folks think," Daniel said. "When I was your age, most of this county still ran open range. No fences at all past the town line. Cattle grazed wherever the grass was best, and a man's herd mixed freely with his neighbors. This wire's changed most of that inside the last several years. Now a man's got to mark his line plain, or somebody else's herd eats through what he's saved back for winter." "Do you like it, the wire?" Daniel considered that longer than the question seemed to need. "Can't say I do entirely. Something changes about a piece of land once you draw a hard line around it. But a man's got to protect what's his, particularly these last few years, with the county the way it's been." He looked down at Samuel. "I intend to protect what's mine a good deal more carefully going forward." Samuel didn't fully understand the weight behind that, though he understood enough of it to smile back at Daniel, unguarded the way only a child who hasn't yet learned to hold anything back is able to smile. It was Josie, watching the two of them from the porch most mornings, who felt the shift most sharply, not simply in Samuel, who had bloomed in a matter of days into a boy she barely recognized from the quiet, careful child who'd grown up in a narrow room off Congress Avenue, but in herself watching a version of the life she'd once planned finally tentatively begin to take shape 9 years later than either of them had intended. She and Daniel found their way back to each other less through conversation than through the small, ordinary work of running a household together. Josie took over the mending without being asked, and Daniel began leaving his shirts folded over the back of the kitchen chair instead of tossed in a heap, a habit he'd never had cause to practice living alone. She noticed. She never said anything about it. She only threaded her needle and let the noticing sit quiet between them. Some evenings he went over the ranch accounts by lamplight, while she sewed across the table from him, and neither of them spoke for the better part of an hour, and neither of them minded. Once reaching for the same spool of thread at the same moment their hands met on the tabletop, And Daniel didn't pull his back right away, and Josie didn't either. Nothing more came of it than that a few seconds of stillness neither one was in any hurry to end. He fixed the loose board on the porch step the second morning. Not because anyone had asked, but because he'd watched her catch her foot on it the evening before and hadn't cared for the sight of it. She noticed that too, the particular quiet way Daniel Reeves showed he cared about something. Never announced. Never made a show of. Simply done and left for a person to discover on their own. One Sunday with Samuel off at the forge with Amos for the afternoon, Josie found Daniel out past the barn checking a fence line that plainly didn't need checking, and she walked out to join him without either of them remarking on it. They stood together at the rail a long while watching the cattle graze in the late light, saying very little. It was Josie thought about as close to the life they'd once planned at the crossing as either of them had come in 9 years. They spoke plainly too most evenings after Samuel had gone to sleep in the small room Daniel had cleared out for him, working through the shape of 9 lost years, one conversation shown at a time, not to reclaim what they'd missed. Both of them understood that was impossible, but to build something honest going forward that neither of them had to guess at. Their peace didn't hold past the first week, just past 4 o'clock on a Thursday. The sound of a wagon driven hard down the ranch road reached the porch, and Daniel went still, recognizing the pair of matched bays before he ever saw the driver clearly. Walter Pruitt reined up at the edge of the yard, not bothering to climb down, sitting instead with the easy, practiced authority of a man who had spent 9 years believing his standing in Williamson County went unquestioned by anyone with sense enough to know better. "Reeves," Pruitt said, touching the brim of his hat, without any real courtesy behind the gesture. "Word travels fast in a small county. Understand you've got the Callaway woman staying out here, and a boy nobody in town's quite been told the particulars about." Josie had come out onto the porch at the sound of the wagon, one hand resting protectively near Samuel's shoulder where he stood beside her, and something in Pruitt's gaze sliding briefly and deliberately over the two of them told her plainly enough that this visit carried a purpose considerably sharper than simple neighborly curiosity. "State your business, Walter," Daniel said, stepping down off the porch, unhurried. "Or turn that wagon around. My business is the county's business," Pruitt said. "Same as it's been for years now. I've had word that Josephine Callaway has returned to Round Rock without a husband's name attached to her, and a boy in tow nobody's offered any accounting for. That kind of arrangement raises questions about respectability. I'm obliged in my capacity with the county to take some interest in." "You've got no capacity that concerns my family," Josie said, coming down the porch steps, herself, now her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Whatever business you think you have with me, Walter Pruitt, you'll state it plainly or you'll leave this land. The Forge Properties tax lien comes due for county auction inside the month," Pruitt said, as though she hadn't spoken at all. "Debts stood unresolved for 9 years now. Amos Callaway's had ample time to settle it and hasn't. County's within its rights to move the sale forward, particularly given his health, from what I understand, isn't what it once was." "That debt was never real," Josie said. "You know it wasn't real. You built it yourself." Something flickered behind Pruitt's eyes. Not quite alarm, not yet, but the first thin crack in 9 years of carefully maintained composure. "That's a serious accusation to level at a county official without a shred of proof behind it, Miss Callaway. Won't hold up anywhere that matters, and I'd think carefully before repeating it where anyone else might hear." "Maybe not today," Daniel said, coming to stand beside Josie, his voice gone low and even in a way that carried more weight than shouting would have. "But there's a boy standing in that yard who deserves better than growing up believing the man who tried to ruin his grandfather walks around this county respected. I'd think hard on that, Walter, before you ride off this land." Pruitt held Daniel's gaze a moment longer than comfort would have allowed, then wheeled his wagon and drove back the way he'd come. Though the look he threw over his shoulder told both of them plainly enough that the matter was far from settled. It was 2 days later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, that a young man Josie didn't recognize came walking up the ranch road on foot, hat in hand, clearly working up the nerve for something, before he'd even reached the porch. "Ma'am," he said when Josie came out to meet him. "Name's Thomas Ainsley. I worked the Round Rock post office under Mr. Pruitt for near 6 years, up until this past spring, when I took a position at the feed store instead." "I don't believe we've met, Mr. Ainsley." "No, ma'am, we haven't. But I knew your name a long while before today." He turned his hat over once in his hands, working through something clearly difficult to say. "Mr. Pruitt kept a tin box in the back office, ma'am, separate from the regular mail sorting. I never asked about it directly, wasn't my place, and I needed the position. But I saw him set letters aside into that box more than once over the years, letters addressed both to and from a Calloway and a Reeves. Never delivered so far as I ever saw." Josie's hand went still on the porch rail. "When I left his employ this spring," Ainsley continued, "I found that box left behind in a storage shed out back of the post office, forgotten or abandoned. I couldn't say which. I kept it, ma'am, not rightly knowing what to do with it, until I heard in town you'd come back. Seemed to me it belonged to you a good deal more than it ever belonged to him." He handed her a small tin box, dented at one corner, considerably heavier than its size suggested. Josie's hands shook as she pried the lid loose that evening at Daniel's kitchen table. Samuel already asleep down the hall, Daniel standing close beside her rather than sitting across from her, one hand resting steady on her shoulder, though he said nothing at all. Inside lay nearly 40 letters, some in her own careful hand, some in Daniel's, every one of them stamped and addressed correctly, every one of them never delivered. Beneath the letters, folded separately, lay a single sheet in Walter Pruitt's own unmistakable handwriting, a draft of the false ledger he'd shown Deputy Combs 9 years before, complete with a crossed-out earlier attempt at forging Amos Calloway's signature before he'd gotten it close enough to pass. "He kept it," Josie said quietly, staring at the evidence of 9 stolen years laid out plainly across Daniel's kitchen table. "All this time he kept it, instead of destroying it. Why would a man keep the very proof of what he'd done? Same reason plenty of men keep the things that ought to hang them," Daniel said. Some part of him needed to know it was real, even while the rest of him worked hard to make certain nobody else ever would. He looked at her steadily across the lamplight. "The county auction comes up inside the month. I expect this belongs at that hearing." Josie laid out plain in front of everyone. Walter Pruitt spent 9 years convincing to trust him. Josie nodded, closing the tin box carefully, her hand finally steady again. "Then that's where it goes." The Williamson County tax auction was held in the same courthouse hall where half the district's land disputes, water rights, and public business had been settled for as long as anyone in Round Rock could remember, and Walter Pruitt presided over the proceedings that morning as county tax assessor, seated behind a long table at the front of the room, with the easy, practiced authority of a man who had never once expected to be challenged in that particular chair. The hall was fuller than usual, word having traveled through town that the old Calloway Forge property, tied up for 9 years in an unresolved debt dispute, was finally coming up for auction. Amos Calloway sat in the second row, older and grayer than the man who'd fled Round Rock 9 years before, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Daniel sat beside him, and Josie stood at the end of the row, the tin box held steady in both hands. Pruitt called the Calloway matter first, reading the terms of the auction aloud, in the flat procedural voice of a man expecting no interruption before the sale could proceed to bidding. Josie stood before he'd finished the second sentence. "Before this auction goes forward, Mr. Pruitt," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, steadier than she felt, "I believe the county ought to see something relevant to whether that debt exists at all. She walked to the front of the room and laid the false ledger's original draft on the table in front of him. The crossed-out, imperfect first attempt at forging her father's signature, plainly visible beside the polished version Pruitt had eventually presented to Deputy Combs 9 years before. Beside it, she placed a handful of the intercepted letters, their postmarks and addresses, unmistakable proof that mail between her family and Daniel Reeves had been deliberately withheld for years by the very man now presiding over the sale of their land. The hall went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone present understands all at once that something has shifted permanently. "This is my father's forgery in your own hand, Mr. Pruitt," Josie said, "kept along with 9 years of letters you chose to hide rather than destroy. I'd like the county clerk to compare this handwriting against the tax assessment records you've filed under your own signature these past 9 years. I expect the match will speak for itself." Pruitt's composure 9 years in the careful building cracked open in front of the entire room. "This is a serious and entirely unsubstantiated accusation," he said, though his voice had lost the flat certainty it carried moments before. "A forged document proves nothing about who forged it. Then let the county clerk make that determination plainly in front of everyone here," Daniel said, standing now beside Josie. "You've had 9 years to hide behind your office, Walter. I don't expect that office will shield you much longer." A chair scraped near the back of the hall. Deputy Combs got to his feet, turning his hat over slowly in his hands, the same way Thomas Ainsley had turned his on the ranch road days before. "Truth is," Combs said, and the words came out reluctant, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried longer than he wanted to admit. "I never did sit right with that ledger 9 years back. Signature looked a shade too careful to me, even then, but Mr. Pruitt had the notary seal and the standing, and I had no cause of my own to question either. I've thought on it more than once since. I'd like the record to show I'm asking now what I ought to have asked then." Pruitt's eyes cut to Combs with something sharper than surprise. "You'll not put your own carelessness on my account, Deputy." "I'm not looking to," Combs said evenly. "I'm looking to see it settled honest same as anybody else in this hall." County Clerk Whitfield, seated near the front, with the district's official land records at his side, rose without waiting to be asked, and requested the ledger and a sample of Pruitt's filed signature be set side by side for the room to examine. The comparison took less than a minute. The match was unmistakable, the same slight forward lean on every capital letter, the same particular loop on the lowercase g present in both documents. "Mr. Pruitt," Whitfield said, his voice grave, "I'll need a full accounting of this matter before this office proceeds with any further business under your signature." Pruitt's hands resting on the table in front of him had begun visibly shaking, though he made no move toward anything at all, understanding even in that moment the difference between a private threat made on a quiet ranch road and a public reckoning made in front of the county he'd spent 9 years believing entirely his own. He offered no honest answer, and none was forthcoming. The county suspended Walter Pruitt from both his tax assessor's office and his postmaster appointment before the hall had fully emptied that afternoon, pending a full investigation. The Callaway Forge auction was struck from the docket, entirely the debt underlying it declared void on the spot. Word moved through Round Rock faster than it ever had, carrying rumor against the Callaway name carrying, instead, for the first time in 9 years, something closer to a public and overdue accounting of the truth. Amos Callaway, sitting in the second row through the whole of it, allowed himself for the first time since that frightened night 9 years before to fully exhale. Josie found Daniel's hand as the hall slowly emptied around them, and neither of them let go of it on the long walk back out into the Round Rock afternoon. Walter Pruitt left Round Rock before the season was out, his cotton gin sold quietly to a buyer from Georgetown, his standing in the county gone entirely inside a matter of weeks. Few in town mourned the departure, and fewer still spoke of him afterward, beyond the occasional low remark about a man who'd mistaken 9 years of unchecked authority for permanent standing. Amos Calloway reopened the forge that same autumn, his reputation restored more fully than he'd dared hope, for customers returning within the first month, in numbers that suggested the whole county had been quietly waiting for the truth to clear his name. He worked slower than he once had, his health not fully what it used to be. But he worked, and most mornings now, Samuel could be found at the forge alongside him, learning the particular patience of shaping iron, the same way his grandfather once had. Daniel proposed to Josie that October at the Brushy Creek crossing, the same shallow stretch of water where he'd first found the nerve to speak to her a decade before. He didn't kneel on the gravel this time, either, having learned nothing new on that particular point in 9 years. But he took both her hands the same way he had the first time, and this time he'd finished the comb. "I don't have back the years we lost," he said, the reed pattern carved clean and complete along the handle now, "but I've got the rest of them if you'll still have me." "I never stopped having you, Daniel Reeves," Josie said, laughing through tears that carried nothing at all of the sorrow that had once come with his name. "Not for one day of the 9 years I spent believing otherwise." Samuel stood a short distance off at the creek's edge, skipping stones with the easy confidence of a boy who'd spent the better part of 2 months learning every corner of the ranch he now called home. And when Daniel finally straightened up from asking Josie the question he'd carried unfinished for 9 years, Samuel came splashing back through the shallow water toward them both. "Does this mean you're going to be my father?" he asked, plain and unguarded, the way only a child who has never learned to hold a question back is able to ask it. Daniel crouched down to meet him at eye level, the water still running cool and clear around both their boots. "If you'll have me," Daniel said, "I'd be glad to be exactly that." "I'd have you," Samuel said without a moment's hesitation, and something in Daniel's chest, carried tight and careful for 9 long years, finally came loose all at once. They married that November at Brushy Creek Baptist Church, the same small congregation that had once quietly speculated a decade before about whether the Reeves boy and the Calloway girl might make a match of it. Amos walked his daughter down the aisle himself, steadier on his feet than he'd been in months, and Samuel stood at the front, beside Daniel, holding the wedding ring in a small cedar box he'd helped Otis carve for the occasion. Mrs. Odell traveled up from Austin for the ceremony, declaring the whole affair with evident satisfaction, considerably finer than anything her narrow boarding house on Congress Avenue could ever have hosted. And Josie held her hand tight through the whole service, grateful for the woman who had given her and Samuel a home when they'd had nowhere else to go. Afterward, the wedding party gathered at the Reeves ranch tables set out under the open Texas sky, and as the light began to fade, gold over the pasture, Daniel found Josie standing near the corral fence where Samuel had first met Clover 2 months before, watching their son show the old mare off to a cluster of admiring cousins with the easy pride of a boy finally at home. 9 years, Daniel said, coming to stand beside her. "Feels like a strange thing to be grateful for, in a way. All that time lost." "I've thought on that too," Josie said. "I don't know that I'd call it gratitude exactly, but I don't know that we'd have understood what we had, either of us, if we hadn't spent 9 years learning what it cost to lose it." Daniel didn't have a full answer for that, only reached over and took her hand, the same steady, certain grip he'd offered her at the creek crossing a decade before. And together, they watched their son grow smaller against the wide Texas evening home at last, in every sense either of them had ever hoped the word could hold.
What stayed with me most about Daniel and Josie's story isn't the wedding, and it isn't even the wedding, sweet as it was. It's the quiet, ordinary strategy of 2 good people kept apart for 9 years by a lie neither of them ever got the chance to question. And the reminder that a man convinced of his own reasons can do a great deal of harm without ever once believing himself the villain of the story. If there's something worth carrying home from this one, I think it's this: before you believe the worst about someone you love deeply, ask whether you are hearing the whole of it or only the version someone else found convenient to hand you. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the longest. I always love hearing which moment find their way into your heart. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If Daniel and Josie's story found its way into yours, stay close. There are more stories like it waiting, more quiet corners of the old West still holding on to second chances. Until next time, friends, hold on a little tighter to the people you love and ask the hard questions before too much time slip away.